Good evening, wanderer of stories. Tonight we ascend to the lofty peaks of Mount Olympus, where storm clouds gather at the will of a single deity. You probably won't survive the raw power of a god who hurls lightning as easily as mortals breathe. Find a comfortable spot, allow your shoulders to soften, and let the steady rhythm of your breath guide you towards stillness. While you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy my work. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what hour glows on your clock. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Zeus rose to supremacy by leading his siblings in a cataclysmic revolt against the ancient Titans, wresting control of the sky and founding a reign defined by thunderous decrees. According to mythic genealogy, he hurled lightning bolts forged by Cyclopean smiths to shatter the earth and bind the defeated Titans in deep chasms, establishing himself as arbiter of cosmic order. One mainstream historical fact is that Hesiod's Theogony records Zeus's victory over Cronus and the Titans as the foundational myth of divine hierarchy. Historians still argue whether this narrative reflects a real shift from earlier Minoan storm deities to the later pan-Hellenic sky god, or if it served purely as poetic justification for an emerging patriarchal culture. His temple atop Mount Olympus overlooked realms of gods and mortals alike, where priests interpreted thunder as Zeus's pronouncements and consulted omens like rumbling clouds or sudden gusts of wind. Pilgrims packed sanctuary steps, their sandals clacking against worn marble, hoping to catch a fragment of divine favor. Sacred oak groves surrounding these temples exuded the resinous scent of pine and damp earth, each breeze carrying a faint tang of ozone that clung to tunics. A curious fringe tidbit suggests that some ancient worshippers believed an eagle circling thrice above an altar portended immediate justice or vengeance, though written evidence remains scant, and scholars still debate the practice's authenticity. Zeus's rule extended beyond raw displays of might. He dispensed justice among gods and humans, wielding thunder as both weapon and symbol of authority. Myths recount marriages brokered and treaties enforced by his intervention, his decisions resonating in city-state laws that invoked his name to legitimize rulings. Yet he was infamous for capricious whims. Lovers whisked away in the form of golden rain or hidden in clouds, underscoring a volatile personality more akin to a jealous sovereign than a dispassionate judge. Historians still argue whether these tales of seduction and betrayal functioned as cautionary allegories about power or as thinly veiled celebrations of aristocratic license. Sensory details from ritual festivals honor his elemental domain. During the Olympic Games, athletes sprinted across dusty tracks under a searing sun, the air thick with sweat and dust. Victors offered bronze statuettes or fragrant garlands at altars where libations of wine mixed with honey dripped onto flaming coals, sending spirals of perfumed smoke toward the sky. The crackle of embers blended with distant shouts, echoing like thunder rolling across a valley. A fringe anecdote mentions competitors anointing their bodies with oil infused with laurel leaves to curry favor, believing the scent would attract Zeus's gaze, though archaeological residues leave room for debate. Despite his omnipotence, Zeus grappled with sibling rivalry and prophetic warnings. Oracle priests warned that one of his own children might overthrow him, prompting him to swallow a pregnant Metis before she could bear progeny. Within his skull, Athena was said to have formed fully armored, prompting priests to caution against too literal a reading of divine anatomy. Historians still argue whether these paradoxical birth myths illustrate ancient meditations on knowledge emerging from chaos, or simply dramatize patriarchal fears of maternal power. Temples dedicated to Zeus dotted the Greek world, from Dodona with its sacred oak and murmuring priests to Olympia with its colossal ivory and gold statue that stood as a wonder of the ancient age. Visitors felt the chill of polished ivory underfoot and traced fingers over gilded sandals carved into the statue's base. The sensation of looking up at a deity nearly 50 feet tall must have inspired awe and a whisper of dread, as if the very air vibrated with divine energy. A mainstream historical fact notes that the statue at Olympia, crafted by Phidias, was considered one of the seven wonders Yet historians still argue whether its location in a remote sanctuary limited its impact on wider Hellenic worship. Zeus's thunderbolts, whether literal or symbolic, remained central to his image. Lightning strikes on altars were sometimes interpreted as direct messages, prompting city official delegates to inspect scorch marks and interpret their angles. Such investigations blended meteorology with divination, creating a hybrid practice where practical observation met mythic meaning. A quirky tidbit records that some observers collected charred altar fragments as talismans, tucking them into leather pouches for protection. An artifact rarely recovered by archaeologists, fueling debates over widespread use. Through epic poems and temple hymns, Zeus's legend shaped moral codes and social structures. His epithets: Zeus Xenios as patron of hospitality, Zeus Horkios as guarantor of oaths, underscored his multifaceted oversight of human affairs. Yet his personal failings, jealousy, infidelity, occasional rage, served as reminders that absolute power carried inevitable unpredictability. Historians still argue whether those contradictions aimed to humanize the divine or to warn against unconditional reverence. Ultimately, Zeus's thunderous reign established a template for divine kingship, omnipotent yet fallible, just yet impulsive, inspiring both reverence and caution. His legacy reverberates in modern notions of authority and justice, a testament to ancient storytelling's enduring capacity to shape collective imagination. As the last echoes of thunder drift into calm, the realm of divine hierarchy turns from the Storm King's lofty throne to the watchful gaze of Olympus's queen. Hera's realm lay in the sanctified bonds of marriage and family, where her watchful eye ensured the sanctity of vows and the continuity of lineage. As consort to the storm-wielding king, she wielded her own authority, presiding over rites that bound households and city-states alike. One mainstream historical fact is that Hera enjoyed major cult centers at Samos and Argos, where priests and priestesses conducted elaborate annual festivals, such as the Heraia and the Procession of Hera, to honor her role as protector of wedlock. Historians still argue whether these grand ceremonies primarily reinforced civic unity under her aegis or served as structured venues for patriarchal elites to affirm social hierarchies. In Argos, the temple precinct resonated with the low murmur of women's voices, chanting hymns to the Queen of Olympus. Incense burners released clouds of lavender and myrrh, their sweet, resinous scent coiling through marble colonnades and lingering on woven tunics. Marble altars bore votive offerings, miniature bronze figurines of husband and wife clasping hands, crusts of honeyed bread, and tokens fashioned from ivory. A curious fringe tidbit suggests that some brides carried small clay models of peacock feathers, Hera's sacred bird, to invoke her favor, though material evidence remains sparse, and scholars still debate the prevalence of this practice. Hera's mythology brimmed with tales of her fierce response to infidelity. When Zeus's amorous adventures threatened the harmony of their union, she employed cunning stratagems and divine punishment. Myths recount how she transformed the goddess Io into a heifer, chaining her under Argus's 100 watchful eyes. Yet Hera was also a guardian goddess. She watched over births by invoking the epithet Hera Teleia, ensuring safe delivery and female solidarity in labor chambers. Historians still argue whether these dual roles, vengeful punisher and nurturing midwife, reflect genuine ancient attitudes toward marital fidelity, or operate as instructive allegories on the perils and protections of wedded life. Festivals in Hera's honor offered both solemn and jubilant moments. During the Heraia at Samos, young women competed in foot races, wearing saffron-dyed chiton tunics and wreaths of fresh olive leaves, their sandals clicking against sun-baked limestone tracks. The air hummed with cheering as victors received garlands of white roses, Hera's emblem, and poured libations of sweet wine mixed with fragrant honey. Later, community feasts unfolded beneath canvas pavilions, the sharp bite of salted fish stews mingling with the smoky aroma of spit-roasted lamb. These sensory details underscored Hera's domain over not just legal bonds but communal celebration of shared hearths. yet Hera's protective influence extended into the domestic sphere. In households across Greece, matrons dedicated a portion of each evening's hearth fire to Hera of the hearth, before rekindling the embers with fresh olive branches. The crackle of burning wood and the warm glow of flames symbolized her watch over home stability. A fringe anecdote claims that some families kept small statuettes of Hera hidden behind wooden doorposts, believing her silent presence repelled misfortune and ensured conjugal harmony, though the frequency of such talismans remains subject to archaeological debate. Despite her stature, Hera contended with persistent tensions. She navigated power struggles among deities and mortals. Her petitions to Zeus often veiled in cautious diplomacy rather than outright confrontation. Myths recount Hera's clandestine alliances with demigods and nymphs in pursuit of personal vendettas, revealing both her political acumen and emotional depth. Historians still argue whether these narratives expose a cultural discomfort with powerful women exercising agency, or simply dramatize the complexities of divine marriage. Hera's image appeared on coins and pottery, often shown enthroned with a diadem and holding a lotus-tipped scepter. Peacock feathers, a symbol of her all-seeing nature, adorned her throne's gilded backrest, their eye-like patterns signifying vigilance over mortal and divine affairs. Artisans painted her likeness in deep indigo and saffron on fine ceramic craters, the bold outlines capturing her regal bearing. Sound records from temple precincts mention rhythmic drumbeats and the low drone of lyres accompanying hymns, creating a layered soundscape of ceremonial reverence. Her enduring legacy shaped legal customs as well. In many city-states, marriage contracts invoked Hera's name to legitimize dowry arrangements and succession rights. Oaths sworn in her temples carried weightier penalties, as violators believed the goddess herself would enforce retribution through calamities or walled fields yielding no harvest. Such practices illustrate the fusion of religious belief and civic regulation that characterized ancient Greek society. Through poetry and tragedy, Hera's narrative continued to evolve. Playwrights like Euripides explored her motivations, portraying her not merely as a jealous wife, but as a mother deeply invested in her children's welfare, most notably in myths concerning Hephaestus and Hebe. These dramatic treatments invited audiences to reflect on themes of loyalty, power, and the sacrifices of leadership. Historians still argue whether theatrical portrayals softened Hera's image for popular consumption or preserved essential aspects of her divine persona. In sum, Hera's vigilant guardianship over marriage and family embodied the ancient Greeks' profound awareness that social bonds required both sacred sanction and human care. As queen of the gods, she balanced wrath and compassion, her myths warning against betrayal while celebrating the sanctity of union. Her presence echoed in temple rites and hearthside prayers, forging a divine framework within which human relationships found meaning, and where the promise of fidelity remained both gift and challenge under her watchful gaze. As the echoes of sacred marriages fade beneath Olympus's watchful heights, attention drifts downward to the vast realms of sea and earth, where a tempestuous deity commands waves and rumbles the ground. Poseidon, third-born of the great Titangent-slaying siblings, reigned over the boundless sea, the shifting shorelines, and the very tremors that shook the earth. In coastal sanctuaries such as Sunion and Isthmia, worshippers erected temples of white marble overlooking crashing waves, offering bronze tripods and carved horse statuettes upon altars slick with salt spray. One mainstream historical fact is that Poseidon received major cult veneration at the Isthmian Games, where victors dedicated prizes in his honor and athletes raced chariots along sandy tracks near his sanctuary. Historians still argue whether these athletic contests initially served ritualistic appeasement of sea storms or arose purely as communal festivals celebrating maritime prowess. Flanked by sea foam and salt-laden breezes, priests conducted rites at dawn, when the wind carried hints of brine and the distant roar of breakers echoed like muted thunder. Wooden altars stained dark by ritual libations bore bowls filled with amphoric wine, fish oil, and bits of consecrated seaweed. A curious fringe tidbit suggests that some seafaring captains believed Poseidon's favor could be courted by releasing a perfectly trained stallion into the surf to swim ashore carrying an oil-soaked garland. Though, Evidence for this practice survives only in scattered sailors' logbooks and remains debated among maritime archaeologists. Beyond the sea, Poseidon's dominion extended beneath the crust, where he wielded a mighty trident to rend aquifers and fissure earth. Myths recount how a single strike from his three-pronged fork could unleash earthquakes, swallowing entire villages or fracturing mountainous terrain. Coastal cities inscribed prayers on triangular stelae, shaped like his trident, burying them at vulnerable cliff bases to ward off catastrophic quakes. Historians still argue whether such ritual deposits reflect genuine fear of seismic events or emerged later as mythic rationalizations for unexplained ground tremors. Sensory accounts from ancient writers paint vivid scenes of ritual drama. During storm seasons, devotees gathered on rocky promontories, their garments whipped by salt wind, chanting invocations as massive waves hurled foaming columns towards sky. The air grew thick with the briny sting of sea spray, and the rhythmic crash of surf mingled with low horn blasts signaling the deity's approach. Some participants claimed to taste a metallic tang on their tongues, perhaps from airborne plankton or ionized salt, and felt the ground vibrate beneath their sandals, as Poseidon's presence manifested in both water and land. Poseidon's association with horses added another dimension to his cult. In equestrian sanctuaries like the one at Corinth, worshippers dedicated finely harnessed chariots and stamped hoofprints into soft clay as tokens of gratitude. A fringe note in a Corinthian decree mentions priests interpreting a horse's sudden rear or stamp as an omen of approaching storm or calm seas, though whether these observations formed systematic divination practices or casual superstitions remains subject to scholarly debate. The merging of equine imagery and marine power underscored Poseidon's multifaceted authority over strength and wildness. In Homeric epics, Poseidon appears as both ally and adversary to mortals. He calms the sea for Odysseus's return, but also unleashes tempests when slighted. These narrative threads influenced later religious supplications, where sailors recited lines from the Odyssey before embarking, hoping to invoke his benevolence rather than incur wrath. In coastal taverns, elderly mariners recounted how chanting verses under their breath felt like a protective current around their vessels, an oral tradition historians still argue over regarding its prevalence and literal efficacy. Sacrificial feasts honoured Poseidon with offerings of roasted fish, salted sea bass, and crusts of barley bread dipped in brine. Communal banquets took place on boats anchored offshore, the scent of olive oil-soaked fish grilling over open fire blending with the smoky haze of burning driftwood. Drunken revellers toasted the god with spiced wine, their laughter echoing across moonlit waters. Yet beneath the revelry lay an undercurrent of anxiety. Each crack of thunder far out at sea, or unexpected tremor beneath the hull, reminded them of Poseidon's capricious mood swings. Temples to Poseidon featured elaborate water systems. In Sunion, spring-fed basins channeled clear water through carved stone aqueducts into inner sanctuaries, creating a gentle drip-drip that was said to mirror the deity's heartbeat beneath the waves. The continuous sound of dripping water offered worshippers a meditative backdrop, as if they had descended into the god's oceanic domain. Archaeologists still debate whether these hydraulic installations served ritual purification or practical needs for temple cleanliness. One of Poseidon's most enduring festivals, the lyre, took place every 4 years in Aegina. Rowing competitions preceded solemn ceremonies in his honour, the sharp scrape of oars against oarlocks and the plash of blades in turquoise water setting a rhythmic pulse. At twilight, priests lit braziers along the shoreline, their flickering flames reflecting on rippling waves like a procession of fireflies. The scent of burning cedar chips mixed with the smoke of seaweed torches, creating a sensory tapestry both intoxicating and ominous. Throughout Greek art, Poseidon appears on black figure pottery wielding his trident, sometimes astride a sea monster chariot drawn by hippocampi. Mythical creatures half horse, half fish. Painters favoured russet and teal pigments to highlight the god's dynamic posture, the bold outlines conveying his raw energy. Sculptors carved marble statues with deep furrows in his brow and flowing locks that seemed to swirl like tidal currents. In both mediums, artists captured his fierce temperament and elemental force. Legends of Poseidon's mortal offspring carry echoes of his power in the human world. Figures like Theseus and Triton inherited aspects of his might, earthquakes or aquatic command, embedding his legacy within heroic narratives. Temples sometimes erected dual shrines to father and son, their cults intertwined in rituals that celebrated both divine and semi-divine influence. Historians still argue whether these joint cult practices indicate localized hero worship or broader integration of mythic genealogies. In sum, Poseidon's dominion over sea, storm, and subterranean fury shaped Greek religion's visceral core. From thunderous waves to trembling earth, his presence reminded ancient peoples of nature's unpredictable grandeur. His worship blended spectacle and solemnity, seeking harmony with forces that lay both beyond and beneath the mortal sphere. As waves receded and the ground stilled, communities returned to shore, carrying with them the salt-soaked memory of a god who bridged water and stone with his trident's thunderous touch. As the roar of waves and tremors fades into the whisper of grass and grain, our journey moves to the golden fields tended by the earth's nurturing hand. Demeter, revered as the goddess of agriculture and the seasons, guided ancient communities through the cyclical dance of sowing and harvest. In sanctuaries at Eleusis and Nysa, her devotees gathered for rites that celebrated the planting of barley in spring and the reaping of ripe wheat in autumn. One mainstream historical fact is that the Eleusinian Mysteries, secret ceremonies held annually for nearly 2 millennia, honored Demeter and her daughter Persephone, promising initiates a blessed fate beyond death. Historians still argue whether these rites originated as fertility rituals tied to crop cycles, or evolved later into more abstract initiatory traditions of spiritual renewal. Fields dedicated to Demeter stretched in endless waves of green shoots and golden ears, their soil rich with loamy fragrance. Priests carried sheaves of fresh barley into dim stone chambers, the hushed crackle of stalks underfoot echoing against ancient walls. In the open air, participants burned offerings of poppy petals and dried fig branches, filling the dawn breeze with sweet, heady smoke. A fringed tidbit suggests that some initiates nibbled wild pomegranate seeds during nocturnal processions, an act linked to Persephone's underworld sojourn, though scant literary references leave scholars divided over its true significance. As the seasons turned, Demeter's touch shaped every aspect of rural life. During the spring festival known as Thesmophoria, women across Attica practiced ritual fasting, abstaining from grain for several days to honor the goddess's search for her lost daughter. They descended into earthen pits to deposit piglets, ceremonially burying seeds of sorrow and hope. Historians still argue whether these chthonic rites symbolized agricultural cycles of death and rebirth, or served as cloistered women's gatherings under the guise of religious observance. Sensory testimony from agricultural observers survives in fragments of travel diaries. One account describes the loamy scent of turned earth after the first autumn plough, a damp aroma tinged with the sweet rot of fallen leaves. Another recalls the sound of scythes slicing through stalks under a blistering sun, each slice accompanied by a metallic hiss as steel met stalk. Voices of reapers, chirpy with exhaustion, rose in work songs that mimicked bird calls, believed to coax ripening and ward off crows. Such communal labour wove together crop cultivation and social cohesion in Demeter's service. In Eleusis, pilgrims inhaled the musky odour of sacred kykeon, a ritual drink of barley, water, and mint, consumed to induce visions of Demeter's grief and joy. The bitter sweetness of the brew lingered on the tongue, its cool liquid sliding down the throat like liquid earth. Participants reported hearing whispered revelations in the darkened telesterion, a massive hall whose stone benches cold against skin. A curious fringe anecdote suggests that some claimed auditory hallucinations, perhaps induced by kykeon's psychoactive properties, though modern researchers still debate the drink's actual ingredients and effects. Demeter's mythic narrative underscored the intimate link between human survival and divine favour. When Persephone was seized by Hades, the earth mourned with her mother, fields lay fallow, and famine spread until a compromise restored half the year's abundance. This story provided an ancient explanation for winter's barrenness and spring's resurgence. Historians still argue whether this duality reflects early agrarian understanding of seasonal dormancy or later theological overlay interpreting agricultural hardship as divine punishment. Harvest rituals offered rich sensory interplay. During the threshing festivals, communities gathered in courtyards to beat wheat with flails on earthen floors, the rhythmic thwack of wood on grain echoing like thunder. Chaff rose in golden clouds, catching sunlight like drifting sparks, while the scent of crushed stalks, dry, sweet, and dusty, coated the air. Women in saffron-coloured himation separated grains by tossing them into baskets as light breezes carried away the husks. A fringe note in a regional account claims that some threshers rubbed freshly threshed wheat between their palms and inhaled deeply, believing the aroma ensured future fertility of both land and family. Demeter's iconography appeared on ceramics and reliefs. Serene figures clad in russet robes, holding sheaves aloft, or nurturing torch-lit search parties for Persephone. Artists favoured ochre and teal pigments to highlight folds of fabric and the sheen of ripe grain. In some vase paintings, a stoic Kerberos stands beside Demeter's chariot, linking her domain to underworld mysteries. Such visual representations reinforced her dual roles as giver of life and keeper of hidden secrets beneath the soil. Legal codes in many polias invoked Demeter's name to regulate land tenure and harvest duties. Contracts bound tenant farmers to rent a portion of produce to the temple's granaries, ensuring both civic sustenance and divine tribute. Historians still argue whether these agrarian levies stemmed from genuine religious obligation or emerged as pragmatic mechanisms for resource management cloaked in sacred sanction. In domestic precincts, householders reserved a hearth corner for Demeter's small altar, placing fresh bread or corn cobs as daily offerings. The crackle of hearth flames and the warm scent of baking barley cakes symbolized her ever-present care. One quirky tidbit reports that some families left out a single grain of wheat beneath sleeping mats, believing it would foster dreams of abundance, though archaeological evidence for this practice remains elusive. Demeter's influence extended through poetry and drama. In Homeric hymns, her voice echoes with both fierce maternal fury and tender compassion, guiding listeners from sorrow to celebration. Tragedians like Euripides dramatized her search for Persephone, using choral chants that mimicked rustling fields and lamenting winds. Historians still argue whether these literary portrayals shaped actual ritual forms or were poetic embellishments for stage effect. Through seasons of growth and decline, Demeter's nurturing essence sustained ancient life. Her mysteries offered solace beyond mortality, promising renewal beneath each shroud of snow and frost. From seed to stalk to loaf, human hands and divine grace intertwined in fields under her gentle watch, an enduring testament to agriculture's sacred roots and the goddess who made each harvest possible. As the golden sheaves settle into granaries and the scent of gathered grain drifts away, our path turns toward the citadel's lofty heights, where wisdom and strategy take the form of a warrior goddess. Athena emerged, fully grown and armoured from the brow of Zeus, embodying the union of intellect and martial prowess in a single divine figure. Born without a mother in mythic narrative, she symbolized the mind's spontaneous birth, a theme celebrated in temples like the Parthenon on the Athenian Acropolis. One mainstream historical fact is that the Parthenon's inner chamber housed the colossal gold and ivory statue of Athena Parthenos, crafted by the sculptor Phidias in the 5th century BCE. Historians still argue whether this monumental cult image primarily functioned as a religious focal point for civic identity, or stood also as a political symbol of Athenian power and cultural ascendancy. Worshippers approached her sanctuaries beneath the sharp silhouette of olive trees, their silvery leaves whispering in the breeze like distant counsel. The subtle aroma of crushed olives clung to the marble floors, mingling with the faint residue of burnt laurel branches from nightly vigils. Priests poured libations of pure olive oil into sculpted bowls, the golden liquid catching torchlight and casting dancing reflections on sanctuary walls. A fringe tidbit suggests that some artisans believed the statue's gilded sandals were dipped not once, but twice, in melted gold, creating a layered sheen that would catch the sun's rays at dawn. Though scientific analysis of surviving fragments leaves this claim open to debate. Athena's domains extended from strategy and warfare to crafts and weaving, guiding both generals and artisans. In civic assemblies, generals invoked her epithet Athena Promachos before battle, seeking clarity of mind and tactical foresight. Meanwhile, in workshops, Weavers dedicated looms to Athena Ergane, offering threads dyed in indigo and saffron as tokens of gratitude. Historians still argue whether the goddess's dual patronage indicates an ancient Greek view of intellect as equally vital on the battlefield and in household industry, or reflects later theological attempts to unify disparate cult practices under one deity. Festival processions like the Pantheon showcased her multifaceted nature. During the Lesser Pantheon, citizens paraded a woven peplos, an elaborately embroidered garment depicting battles between gods and giants, to dress her monumental statue. Participants marched in saffron and teal tunics, the soft rustle of fabric mingling with the rhythmic beats of bronze cymbals. The peplos itself bore scenes of strategic genius and martial valor, crafted by hand in communal workshops, underscoring Athena's guidance in both art and warfare. A curious fringe anecdote recounts that some older weavers stitched tiny protective symbols, perhaps rudimentary versions of magical seals, into hidden corners of the garment, though the prevalence of such hidden motifs remains a contentious point among textile historians. In mythic lore, Athena favored heroes who exemplified cleverness over brute force. She lent her aegis, a goatskin shield adorned with the Gorgon's head, to Perseus, turning terror into triumph. Yet she famously spurned Ares's battlefield frenzy, valuing measured tactics and defensive fortifications instead. One mainstream historical fact is that Athenians credited her with aiding in the design of the city's fortification walls, known as the Long Walls, linking Athens to its port at Piraeus. Historians still argue whether mythic claims of divine assistance reflect real architectural innovations by human engineers or later mythopoetic attributions to enhance civic pride. Sensory recollections from ancient writers evoke the hush before strategic councils. Leaders gathered in olive-shaded groves outside the city, the air heavy with the scent of earth and olives, as Athena's devotees burned incense of thyme and rosemary to sharpen focus. The low drone of voices debating troop formations blended with the distant clatter of leather sandals on packed earth. Some accounts mention the metallic ring of bronze armor adjusted on shoulders, an auditory reminder that intellect and action walked in tandem under Athena's auspices. Artistic depictions of Athena highlight her stern yet composed visage. On black figure pottery, she stands poised with spear and shield, her helmet crested with a griffin motif. Painters used ochre highlights on her robes and enamel-like teal on her shield's edge, the flat color fields emphasizing her serene determination. Sculptures in temple pediments often show her striding forward, her peplos's folds rendered in bold outlines that capture both movement and majesty. A fringe note suggests sculptors sometimes added real bronze rivets to her shields for extra luster during sunlight festivals, though no surviving statues preserve these details, leaving their existence a subject of scholarly conjecture. Her wisdom extended to civic laws and moral philosophy. In some city-states, judges swore oaths in her temple, invoking Athena Glaucopis, the bright-eyed, to witness their commitment to fair rulings. Public squares featured small altars where citizens left votive plaques inscribed with appeals for guidance in personal disputes. Historians still argue whether these ritual practices fostered genuine judicial impartiality or served as performative gestures masking underlying political power plays. Athena's role in domestic crafts offered another layer of connection with everyday life. Women weaving at home dedicated the first thread of a bridal garment to Athena, seeking her blessing for marital harmony and skillful handiwork. The rhythmic click of heddles and the gentle tug of warp threads created a sensory backdrop of focused labor echoing her creative spirit. A curious fringe anecdote speaks of midwives invoking Athena Poliouchos, guardian of the city, in childbirth, leaving small olive twig charm bracelets on newborn wrists to ensure both city and family thrived under her watchful guidance. Philosophers and playwrights shaped her intellectual aura. Plato's Academy featured statues of Athena alongside those of Socrates and Pallas, her epithet echoing in the school's name. Tragic poets referenced her when exploring themes of hubris and clever counsel, using her interventions as narrative pivots that underscored human folly and divine oversight. Historians still argue whether such literary portrayals deepened public reverence for wisdom or simply employed her image for dramatic effect. Through her intricate bond with both war and weaving, Athena stood as a bridge between the martial and the domestic, the cerebral and the tactile. Her multifaceted presence in stone sanctuaries, perforated looms, and battle plans illustrates an ancient belief that human endeavors flourished under the guidance of a mind both fierce and fair. As the final echoes of looms silent and helmets stowed away fade from our senses, the narrative shifting from strategy to the sunlit realms of prophecy and healing lies just beyond the horizon, led by the radiant charioteer of dawn. As the echo of strategic counsel and the soft rustle of woven peplos fade, our path follows the golden arc of dawn, where a radiant deity guides both music's melody and the future's whisper. Apollo, son of Zeus and Leto, drove his sun chariot across the sky each morning, bringing light, music, and prophecy to the world below. In Delphi, his most famous sanctuary, pilgrims journeyed over rugged mountain paths to consult the Pythia, an oracle whose cryptic utterances shaped decisions from city-states' wars to private marriages. One mainstream historical fact is that inscriptions at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi bear the Delphic maxims "Know thyself" and "Nothing in excess," reflecting the god's moral counsel. Historians still argue whether these aphorisms originated as authentic oracular pronouncements or were later 2nd century additions by rhetorical sophists seeking to codify virtue. Within the temple's shadowed interior, priests prepared the Pythia by cleansing her with spring water and dressing her in saffron robes scented with bay laurel, the air filled with the resinous aroma of burning laurel leaves, the god's sacred tree, while distant flutes played hushed melodies that mingled with the drip of water from the Castalian spring. Visitors described a hush so profound that each footstep on the stone floor sounded like distant thunder, a sensory reminder that they stood between mortal concerns and divine revelation. A fringe tidbit suggests that subtle geological vapors rising through temple cracks induced trance states in the Pythia, though modern scientists still debate whether such gases existed at levels sufficient to alter consciousness. Apollo's musical gifts extended beyond prophecy. He taught humans the lyre's strings, said to be fashioned from sea turtle shell, then passed the instrument to his favoured mortal disciple, Orpheus. Festivals like the Pythian Games at Delphi included musical competitions alongside athletic events, the air alive with the bright tones of Kithara and Aulos. One curious account from a Roman visitor notes that skilled musicians claimed to hear a distant echo harmonize with their tunes, as though Apollo himself joined the performance, though scholars still argue whether this phenomenon resulted from temple acoustics or poetic license in travel memoirs. Beyond song and light, Apollo served as a god of healing and plague. In myth, he unleashed a deadly pestilence with his silver arrows, yet also held the power to avert disease through his son Asclepius, the god of medicine. At Epidaurus, pilgrims seeking cures slept in the abaton, an enclosed dormitory, hoping for therapeutic dreams or healing visions. Archaeological remains show bronze statuettes of afflicted body parts left as votive offerings. A curious fringe detail describes some worshippers tying amulets shaped like small lizards, symbols of regeneration, to their wrists, though historians still debate whether these charms reflected genuine medicinal beliefs or later folk practices. Temples to Apollo featured architectural harmony reflecting his patronage of order and beauty. The Doric columns at Delphi and Corinth exuded a sense of balanced proportion, their fluted shafts catching early sunbeams in crisp patterns of light and shadow. Visitors noted the smooth coolness of marble under their hands and the faint, chalky scent of ground stone dust underfoot. Historians still argue whether these stylistic choices stemmed from religious symbolism of cosmic harmony or from evolving aesthetic preferences among ancient architects. Each spring, cult rituals marked Apollo's role as bringer of renewal. During the Hyacinthia festival in Sparta, mournful laments for the youth Hyacinthus, struck down by Odysseus, gave way to joyful dances celebrating rebirth and resilience. Participants wreathed their heads with white hyacinth blossoms, the air filled with delicate floral perfume. One fringe anecdote speaks of revelers painting their cheeks with crushed petals to honor the youth's transformation, though whether this practice was widespread remains uncertain due to limited literary references. Apollo's epithets reveal his varied domains. Phoebus as shining, Delian acknowledging his island birth, and Pythian commemorating his slaying of the Python dragon at Delphi. Statues often depicted him as a youthful figure holding a bow or lyre, his form carved in idealized proportions to convey both strength and grace. Painters favored radiant saffron and ivory highlights on his skin, with bold indigo for his robes, flat colors accentuated by thick black outlines in vase art. Such visual cues reinforced his dual nature as both sun god and patron of the arts. Oracle records recount that city-states sought Apollo's guidance in founding colonies, interpreting bowlfuls of barley grains, sacrificial remnants, as omens of fortune or warning. The practice blended agricultural prophecy with divine sanction, illustrating the god's sway over both civic ventures and seasonal cycles. Historians still argue whether the barley-throwing ritual originated in Delphi or emerged independently in multiple locales seeking Apollo's blessing. In literature, Apollo's voice resonated through epic poetry and lyric verse. Homer's epics open with his arrows summoning plague on the Achaeans, while Pindar's odes celebrate his patronage of victors. Tragic playwrights invoked his moral authority to frame themes of fate and hubris, using his unflinching gaze as a measure of human folly. Scholars still debate whether such literary portrayals aim to humanize the god for Greek audiences or to uphold his role as arbiter of divine justice. From sunlit temples to healing sanctuaries, Apollo's domain spanned prophecy, music, and medicine, each facet reflecting a facet of ancient life, seeking order and insight. As dawn's first light spills across our own modern world, we carry forward echoes of his radiant influence. In every rainy morning's promise of sunshine, every healing melody, every whispered wish for guidance, as Apollo's first rays fade into the silver glow of dusk, our tale shifts from prophetic light to the shadowed wilds, where a huntress goddess roams untamed forests and protects those at life's threshold. Artemis, eternal huntress and guardian of wilderness, held domain over moonlit forests, wild creatures, and the mysteries of childbirth. Born second of the twins to Leto on the rugged isle of Delos, she assisted in her brother's birth before vowing to remain ever a maiden, forever untouched by mortal ties. One mainstream historical fact is that her primary sanctuary at Broron in Attica hosted rites in which young girls, arctoi, or little bears, danced in saffron tunics to honor her nurturing and protective aspects. Historians still argue whether these initiatory dances mirrored hunter-gatherer coming-of-age rituals, or later structured civic ceremonies for young women. Pilgrims approached her groves under a canopy of oaks and cypresses, the air alive with the scent of pine resin and damp moss. Bronze torches flickered along winding paths, casting wavering shadows of bowstrings and quivers carved into tree trunks. In open clearings, stone altars bore offerings of wild goats, honey cakes, and sprigs of hyacinth, the goddess's chosen flower. A fringe detail suggests that some devotees tied fox or hare skins to their belts as tokens of her favor, though the archaeological evidence for this custom remains sparse and contested by scholars. Artemis's association with the moon shone through her epithet as Phoebe. Bright. Women seeking relief in childbirth invoked her by leaving drawn images of the crescent moon on birthing room walls to summon her. Swift protection. The faint glow of wax lamps revealed hastily scrawled symbols, the smell of melting tallow mingling with aromatic herbs strewn on straw mats. Historians still argue whether these lunar markings served primarily apotropaic functions or reflected deeper cosmological beliefs about feminine cycles. In myth, Artemis defended her chastity with fierce independence. When the giant Orion threatened her priestesses, she summoned a scorpion that stung him in the heel. His spectral form and the scorpion's constellation both immortalized among the stars. Cult sites sometimes featured reliefs depicting this cosmic hunt, the goddess drawn with taut bow and arrow poised against a subdued Orion. Artistic renditions used rich indigo backgrounds to denote night skies, the fine brown outlines capturing the tension of the chase. Debate continues over whether these depictions influenced celestial mapping or emerged as later astrological interpretations. Ritual hunts formed a central part of Artemis's worship. In early spring, devotees enacted solemn stag chases in fenced glades, the crackle of underbrush under leather sandals mingling with the mournful bleat of corners. Captured fawns were released back into the forest as symbols of mercy and renewal, an act historians still argue represented genuine wildlife conservation or ritual theatricality. Participants smeared garlanded antlers with turmeric and saffron poultices, believing the herbs invoked her protective essence. Artemis's festivals, like the Broronia, balanced playfulness and piety. Young girls, having danced as bears, offered their embroidered belts to the goddess and crowned themselves with woven laurel wreaths. The laughter of children echoed through olive groves, the air tinged with citrus blossoms in bloom. One fringe anecdote mentions a custom where initiates whispered secret wishes into the bark of an ancient oak, believing the goddess carried their hopes across moonlit skies, though textual sources debate whether this ritual was widespread. Beyond female rites, male hunters invoked Artemis's favour before setting traplines. Hunters carved small statues of her likeness, bow ready, hunting dog at heel, and placed them near snares, offering fresh fish from nearby streams as tribute. The whisper of netted fish against reeds and the scent of muddy water formed part of these solemn acknowledgments of her wild domain. Historians still argue whether such offerings demonstrated reciprocal respect for nature or masked assertions of human dominion over wildlife. Sanctuaries to Artemis varied from cavern shrines, echoing with dripping water, to open-air altars atop hilltops where the breeze carried distant hound cries. Women's shrines featured crescent-shaped benches carved of marble, worn smooth by generations of visitors seeking comfort and counsel. Visitors noted the coolness of carved stone against bare arms, and the hushed ambience broken only by bird song and rustling leaves. A curious note in a traveller's journal recalls that at certain nights, the moon's reflection in a sacred pool appeared to shimmer with pale electric light, a phenomenon still attributed by some to natural bioluminescence or simply lunar illusion. In art and literature, Artemis's image carried dual aspects of nurturer and avenger. In tragedy, her swift arrows reclaimed those who violated sacred oaths. Actaeon's gaze upon her bath ringing as a cautionary tale. Poets described her voice as a clarion call, sharp and clear in the forest air. Historians still argue whether such literary portrayals aim to humanize the goddess's fierceness or to instruct audiences on boundaries between mortals and divinity. Through moonlit hunts and protective rites, Artemis embodied an essential nexus of wild freedom and maternal guardianship. Her presence in the ancient world reminded communities that life cycles, from birth to maturation, unfolded under her vigilant watch, as unerring as an arrow's flight, and as enduring as the lunar glow guiding travellers through the night. As the moonlit forests grow still and the huntress's arrows rest, a darker presence stirs on the fields of conflict, where the raw thunder of battle finds its fierce embodiment. Ares, the god of war's brutal aspect, embodied the frenzy of combat and the primal courage that surged in warriors' veins. In locales such as Sparta's Platanistas district and the Areopagus Hill in Athens, altars bore his name, and young men approaching military age performed rites to secure his favour before their first battle. One mainstream historical fact is that the Spartans offered ritual sacrifices of boars and bulls to Ares prior to campaigns, believing such gifts would temper his savage impulses into disciplined strength. Historians still argue whether these Spartan rites reflected a genuine belief in divine intervention or functioned chiefly as communal theatre to instill martial identity. Temples dedicated to Ares often stood on city outskirts, their weathered stones exposed to the clang of practice arms. Pilgrims brought iron weapons and bronze helmets as votive offerings, the metallic scent of rust and sweat mingling in the hot sun. Priests anointed new shields with consecrated oil that gleamed like blood on polished bronze, a sensory reminder that warfare's sheen held both terror and reverence. A fringe tidbit suggests that some veteran soldiers carved small phallic charms into casings of their greaves, believing these amulets would invoke Ares's virile power, though scant archaeological evidence leaves this practice subject to debate. Unlike Athena's strategic wisdom, Ares represented battle's chaotic surge. Homeric epics portray him charging into clashes, shrieking and shaking his shield, delighting in the clash of swords and the rush of mortal blood. In cult imagery, he often appeared with a flaming torch and spear, his helmet crested with boar's tusks. Artists used russet and ochre pigments to depict his fierce eyes and rippling muscles across vase paintings, the flat colour blocks emphasizing raw energy over nuanced detail. Scholars still argue whether such portrayals aim to warn against war's horror or to glamorize martial valor for young citizens. Festivals like the Eresia in Attica fused ritual lament with celebratory feasts. Participants first laid fresh garlands of rosemary and bay at his sanctuaries to mourn war's toll, then dined on roasted lamb and barley loaves to honor his life-giving fecundity. The taste of smoky meat mingled with piney incense carried by breeze off the nearby hills, and the rhythmic beat of drums echoed like distant war drums. Fringe accounts record that some guests smeared red ochre on their cheeks during the mourning rites, a symbolic reenactment of battlefield wounds, though historians still debate whether this was widely practiced or confined to specific locales. Ares' oracles were few but potent. At the shrine of Ares in Tegea, priests interpreted the flight paths of vultures as portents of victory or defeat. The bird's wings whipping through hot, dusty air produced a dry hiss that worshippers equated with the god's breath. When a vulture overhead circled twice before landing on a sacrificial carcass, priests declared the omen favourable. When it tore away at the flesh before descent, they braced for misfortune. Historians still argue whether such avian divination reflected broader Greek ornithomancy traditions or remained a localized Tegean practice. The sensory milieu of martial worship offered stark contrasts. In Spartan training grounds, the iron tang of blood lingered long after mock battles ended. Young soldiers wrestled under midday sun, their grunts and the thunk of wooden practice swords echoing against limestone walls. Nearby priests chanted invocations that rose above the din, their words indistinct yet insistent, shaping the ambient roar into a solemn tribute to Ares' domain. A curious fringe detail notes that some recruits wore barley flour on their hair during trials, believing the pale dust would absorb panic like a shield. Scholars remain divided over whether this custom served practical cooling purposes or bore symbolic meaning. Mythic narratives cast Ares in both positive and negative lights. In some local tales he protected city-states against external threats, while in others he sowed discord among gods, inciting brawls on Olympus. Hesiod records his liaison with Aphrodite, an ironic coupling of war and love, betrayed by Hephaestus' cunning trap. Historians still argue whether these myths conveyed ancient Greek ambivalence toward war's necessity and destructiveness, or simply served as titillating gossip among deities. In heroic legends, Ares' favour proved fickle. Diomedes wounded him in battle, wounding not just flesh but shattering the god's pride. Homer describes his retreat with a groan that shook the heavens. Such episodes underscored that Ares, despite his ferocity, remained vulnerable to human skill and cunning. Sculptors capturing this moment carved furrowed brows and turned backs in marble reliefs, the fine brown outlines conveying both divine anger and wounded ego. Debate persists over whether these depictions aim to humanize the god or to extol human martial excellence. Civic law often invoked Ares' name in matters of conflict resolution and legal sanctions. In some city-states, trial by combat operated under his aegis, facilitating disputes through regulated duels. The clang of metal on metal in judicial arenas echoed his primal domain. Historians still argue whether such martial trials reflected genuine legal practices or later romanticized accounts of archaic customs. Through his festivals, temples, and myths, Ares shaped Greek conceptions of war as both source of valor and vessel of destruction. His presence reminded mortals that conflict carried threads of glory, intertwined with coils of suffering. As the final echoes of shield strikes and battle cries subside, our journey turns from war's fierce domain to the gentle realms of love and beauty guided by a goddess born of sea foam and desire. As the last echoes of battle fade, and the dust settles on clangorous fields, our path glides from martial fury to the gentle yet potent tides of love's domain, where beauty and desire reign supreme. Aphrodite, born of sea foam and celestial union, carried the allure of love and beauty across both mortal and divine realms. Emerging fully formed from the foaming surf near Cyprus, she drifted ashore on scallop shells kissed by salt spray. an image immortalized in the sculptor's vision of a goddess born of ocean's breath. One mainstream historical fact is that a major cult center at Paphos on Cyprus hosted annual festivals in her honor, where processions wound from temple courtyards to rocky coves, celebrating her maritime origins. Historians still argue whether these rites derived from pre-Hellenic fertility traditions or later synthesized Greek religious innovations designed to bolster island identity. Pilgrims approached her coastal sanctuaries at dawn, the scent of wet limestone mingling with sea mist and the gentle aroma of wild roses strewn on shrine steps. Harps and lyres played soft melodies that echoed against cavern walls, creating a hushed soundscape of longing. Priests anointed statues of the goddess with fragrant oils infused with myrrh and frankincense, each bead of amber-hued liquid glinting like captured sunlight. A fringe tidbit suggests that some devotees scattered pomegranate seeds at her feet, echoing Persephone's tale, to symbolize the intertwining of love and mortality, though epigraphic evidence leaves this custom open to scholarly debate. Aphrodite's power extended beyond romantic passion to encompass all forms of attraction and aesthetic harmony. In city-states such as Corinth and Cythera, artisans dedicated sculpted trinkets, small ivory mirrors and gold hairpins at her altars, hoping to invoke her grace in their own craftsmanship. Jewels and seashells heaped around statues caught torchlight, scattering filigreed shadows that danced like flickering hearts. Historians still argue whether these votive offerings served primarily as personal pleas for beauty or as communal affirmations of shared values in style and desire. Myths portray Aphrodite as both benevolent and capricious. She blessed the marriage of Helen and Menelaus with beauty so radiant it launched 1,000 ships. Yet she also incited discord by awarding Paris the golden apple inscribed, "To the fairest," sparking the Trojan War. Artistic depictions on black figure pottery show her poised between cupids tugging on her robes, the flat fields of saffron and indigo accentuating her serene, confident expression. Fringe accounts in Roman-era commentaries claim that some festival-goers engraved barley cakes with miniature apple motifs in her honor, though modern bakers and historians question the practicality and authenticity of such detailed confectionery in ancient times. Sensory recollections from temple ceremonies evoke a tapestry of textures and sounds. Cloaks of velvet and linen brushed against marble floors as worshippers circled altars strewn with rose petals. The sweet tang of crushed petals underfoot released volatile oils that clung to sandals. Priests recited hymns to the Cyprian, their voices rising in soft cadences as bronze bowls of wine were poured into shallow basins. One curious note from a traveller's diary describes a gentle hiss as the wine slid over warm stone, an acoustic echo that worshippers took as Aphrodite's subtle laughter at their devotion. Ritual dances honoured her fluid grace. Young women garlanded in white tunics moved in swaying steps around a central pillar draped with seashells, their bare feet stirring the scent of salt and sandalwood. A fringe anecdote notes that some dancers tied strips of saffron cloth to their ankles, believing the vivid hue would draw the goddess's gaze, though archaeologists have discovered only sporadic saffron residues in sanctuary debris, fueling debate over the practice's prevalence. Aphrodite's matrimonial influence extended to legal customs. In Corinth, marriage contracts invoked her epithet as Corinthia Phila, beloved in Corinth, to sanctify vows and bind dowry agreements. Judges swore oaths by her name in cases of domestic dispute, emphasizing her oversight of fidelity and affection. Historians still argue whether these legal invocations reflected genuine belief in divine intervention or served to reinforce social norms under the veneer of religious sanction. In literature, her voice emerges in lyric poetry and epic verse. Sappho celebrated Aphrodite's power in longing lines that trembled with desire, describing the goddess's golden chariot drawn by doves across the horizon. Meanwhile, Homer's hymn to Aphrodite depicts her playful tricks on gods and mortals alike, blending humor with moral undertones. Scholars debate whether such poetic portrayals humanized the goddess for worshippers or perpetuated complex ideas about love's capricious nature. Artisans captured her essence in reliefs and frescoes. On temple friezes, she stands beside Eros, arrows poised to ignite hearts, her features carved with delicate precision in pale marble. Painters applied shell gold to highlight her jewelry and hair, the minuscule gilded flourishes shimmering under torchlight like captured starlight. These visual cues reinforced her status as both divine sovereign of beauty and keeper of intimate yearnings. Through her myths and cult, Aphrodite reminded mortals that love's currents could uplift and undo. Her presence in coastal sanctuaries and city shrines invited both celebration and caution, an enduring testament to the power of desire in shaping human stories. As the stones of her temple grow cool and the last rose petals settle, our journey flows onward to the blazing forge of divine craftsmanship, where fire and metal take shape under a god's skilled hand. As Aphrodite's whispered, promises of love fade beneath the shell gold glow. Our path forges ahead into the glowing embers of creation, where a master craftsman shapes divine wonders from fire and metal. Hephaestus, the god of fire and metalworking, drew power from volcanic forge and blistering furnace to craft the god's most wondrous artifacts. Born of Hera alone in some myths and cast from Olympus for his lameness in others, he found refuge beneath the island of Lemnos, where wildfire-lit caverns echoed with hammer on anvil. One mainstream historical fact is that Lemnian smithing sites, dating to the 7th century BCE, show advanced metallurgical techniques, suggesting a long-standing tradition of bronze working that inspired Hephaestus's legendary workshop. Historians still argue whether these archaeological remains directly informed mythic depictions of his forge, or whether the legend shaped later interpretations of Lemnian industry. Within subterranean forges, the air rang with the metallic clang of hammers striking red-hot ingots. Sparks flew in golden showers, their brief arcs illuminating soot-darkened walls lined with rows of tongs, bellows, and crucibles. The acrid scent of burning charcoal mingled with sweet resin from pine staves, used to fuel the blaze. A fringe tidbit holds that some Lemnian blacksmiths inscribed protective runes on their bellows to ensure steady airflow, though few inscriptions have survived to confirm the practice beyond literary allusions. Hephaestus's divinely wrought creations spanned the spectrum from mundane to miraculous. In myth, he fashioned Achilles' impervious shield, its concentric scenes of cosmic harmony, capturing both daily life and celestial order, and Hera's golden throne that trapped any who sat upon it until rescued by Dionysus. Artisans of antiquity emulated such craftsmanship. In Corinth, workshops produced intricately forged bronze mirrors and embossed greaves, their glossy surfaces polished by fine pumice. Historians still argue whether these high-quality products reflect direct inspiration from cultic myths, or represent independent innovations in archaic period metallurgy. The sensory world of Hephaestus's forge fascinated ancient observers. Travelers to Lemnos recorded the oppressive heat that made cloaks adhere to skin, the deafening pulse of bellows pumping air into roaring furnaces, and the tang of metal-tinged steam when water cooled glowing anvils. Some reported feeling the ground tremble, as massive hammer strikes echoed into chamber floors, likening it to distant thunder. An echo, perhaps, of Hephaestus's own thunderous parentage. Debate continues over whether these descriptions exaggerate atmospheric effects for dramatic storytelling or accurately portray volcanic near-smithies. Cyclopean assistants, mythical one-eyed craftsmen, served at his side, wielding massive hammers and managing bellows the size of small carts. On relief sculptures, they appear lifting molten bronze from crucibles held by Hephaestus's steady hand. These reliefs use flat colour fields, russet for molten metal, ochre for stone walls, with delicate brown outlines defining muscle and tool alike. A curious fringe anecdote records that some cyclopes were thought to wear leather patches over their single eye during welding to reduce glare, though historians debate whether this reflects genuine protective practices or later artful invention. Festivals like the Hephaestia honoured his fiery realm. During these gatherings in Athens, priests kindled braziers with charcoal and whispered invocations as blacksmiths demonstrated their trade in open workshops along city streets. Spectators inhaled the smoky perfume of cindered wood and watched molten metal pour into moulds like rivers of liquid gold. Some artisans cooled cast statues in water troughs, the hiss of steam rising like applause. Fringe accounts suggest that spectators sometimes dipped coins into cooling metal to test temperature and timing, though practical concerns likely limited such risky participation. Hephaestus's role extended to ritual purification through fire. In Corinth, at the conclusion of Panhellenic gatherings, torches recessed in votive shrines were extinguished and relit in forge fires, symbolically returning communal energy to the divine smith. The sharp scent of burnt olive wood and the flicker of flame against night sky underscored fire's dual nature as destructive and sanctifying. Scholars still argue whether these torch rituals derive from ancient smithcraft symbolism or later civic reinventions to unify diverging cult practices. Myths depict Hephaestus forging gifts for gods and mortals alike, Aphrodite's girdle of irresistible beauty, Hermes' winged sandals, and Daedalus's intricate labyrinth doors. Such tales highlight both divine benevolence and cunning artistry. Vase painters rendered these scenes with bold black outlines, flat teal and saffron accents marking enchanted items. Debate persists over whether these visual narratives influenced actual design motifs in artisans' workshops or simply provided dramatic spectacle for theatrical contexts. Art and architecture echo his touch. The bronze doors at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus and the gilded decorations of Solon's Stoa in Athens bear testament to high metalworking. Archaeological fragments reveal precision-cut bronze ornament, intertwined scrolls, and geometric patterns that suggest advanced casting methods. Historians still argue whether these techniques spread through mobile smith guilds or emerged independently in city-state ateliers. In domestic life, Hephaestus's influence manifested in everyday tools. Sturdy iron plowshares etched with maker's marks and bronze cauldrons hanging from iron hooks over hearth fires. The iron's cold weight and the cauldron's gentle boil blended labour with necessity, reminders that divinely inspired craftsmanship served both epic and ordinary tasks. Fringe evidence from rural settlements hints that some potters used small metal stamps to mark wares in his name, though the practice's prevalence remains subject to scholarly scrutiny. Philosophers like Plato invoked Hephaestus's creative spirit when discussing the transformation of raw materials into beautiful forms. In workshops and academies, dialogues broach themes of artistry and ethics, likening the soul's refinement to the smith's hammer striking rough ore. Tragically, no surviving philosophical treatise focuses solely on his craft, prompting debate over whether his symbolic import outweighed direct intellectual inquiry into metalworking. Through volcanic fires and anvil-echoed rhythms, Hephaestus shaped the tools and trappings of both gods and mortals. His forge bridged divine imagination and human industry, reminding ancient peoples that transformation, whether of metal into weapon or loom into art, depended on skill, patience, and the spark of inspiration. As the last embers glow and bellows fall silent, we journey next from the radiant forge to the swift wings of a messenger god, whose cunning voice carries tales across mortal and immortal realms. As the final sparks fade and the echo of the anvil's ring subsides, our path takes flight on winged sandals toward the swift messenger of gods, whose cunning voice bridges mortal and divine. Hermes, fleet-footed herald of Olympus, guided souls, travelers, and commerce with equal deftness, his winged sandals and petarsos marking him as divine emissary. In sanctuaries such as the Hermea in Arcadia and the ancient way stations along major trade routes, merchants and pilgrims left small statues, herms, carved from limestone or bronze, inscribed with his bearded visage above a squared pillar. One mainstream historical fact is that these hermae served both religious and practical functions, marking crossroads and city boundaries while invoking Hermes' protection for wayfarers. Historians still argue whether their erection was primarily an act of piety or a civic mechanism to regulate travel and trade under divine oversight. Pilgrims approaching roadside shrines felt the cool shade of plane trees, the air tinged with dust from passing carts, and the sweet aroma of pressed olives drying in the sun. Small clay offerings, inscribed with pleas for safe passage, sat beneath his image, accompanied by coin and barley cake crumbs. A fringe tidbit suggests that some travellers whispered secret messages into hollow niches in herms, believing Hermes would carry them swiftly to their recipient. though few written records confirm the practice's prevalence or veracity. In myth, Hermes guided newborn gods and deceased souls alike. As Psychopompus, he led trickling lines of shades through underworld gates, his gentle staff tapping stones that resonated with hollow echoes. Ancient funerary steles sometimes depicted him with a winged cap, Petasos, and Caduceus, the staff entwined by two serpents, symbolizing negotiation and balance. Scholars still argue whether this iconography emerged from Near Eastern motifs or developed independently within Greek symbology of mediation. Merchants dedicated model ships, miniature amphorae, and carved griffins at coastal herms, hoping to secure prosperous voyages. The clink of tiny bronze vessels in shrine bowls mixed with the briny tang of sea air, while the distant creak of masts offered a living chorus to his favour. Historians still debate whether such offerings formed an integral part of ancient maritime insurance-like practices or functioned mainly as ritual gestures appeasing mercurial deities of fortune. Hermes's inventiveness shone in myths of cunning and trickery. He forged the lyre from a tortoise shell and barbed reeds, gifting it to Apollo as token of reconciliation, and in some versions, sparking friendly rivalry between gods of music and mischief. Vase paintings capture this moment in flat swathes of amber and indigo, Hermes's boyish grin outlined in bold brown lines as Apollo tentatively tunes the gleaming instrument. Fringe anecdotes note that certain Cretan shepherds claim to hear nighttime melodies drifting from hidden caves, an auditory tribute to Hermes's musical gift, though archaeological corroboration remains elusive. Rituals honouring Hermes included the Hermaea festivals in Athens and Tanagra, where athletic contests, boxing, foot races, and wrestling mirrored his role as patron of sports and competition. The slap of leather gloves and the breathy pant of runners on packed earth combined with worshippers' cheers to create a soundscape alive with kinetic energy. Participants received small winged sandals carved of wood as victory tokens, their light clatter echoing Hermes's swift domain. Historians still argue whether these festivals derived from earlier rural games or emerged as urban celebrations codifying youthful prowess. Hermes's cunning extended to commerce and thievery, a duality captured in his epithet Keitistes, founder, and Kerix, herald. Merchants invoked his name on balance scales and coin counters, seeking fairness in exchange. Blacksmiths marked weights with his emblem, winged staff and tortoise shell, to certify accuracy. At night, torchlit workshops gleamed with metal dust, the rhythmic clang of scales reset against the caduceus's polished curves. Fringe notes suggest that some thieves secretly carried rusted caduci, tokens of Hermes's patronage of tricksters, as talismans protecting them from capture, a practice scholars continue to debate for its clandestine nature. Literature and oratory celebrate Hermes's eloquence. In Homeric hymns, he weaves words as deftly as weaving myths, his speeches laced with irony. Orators invoked him when swearing oaths, believing his cunning would uncover falsehood. Public speakers on the agora tiptoed between persuasion and deception, their voices carrying echoes of Hermes's silver tongue. Historians still argue whether this rhetorical invocation fostered a culture of trust in negotiation or cynicism toward cunning speech. Artisans depicted Hermes in reliefs and pottery as a slender youth with winged sandals and helmet, often caught mid-stride. Painters applied flat fields of russet on his cloak and saffron on his petasos, the minimal shading emphasizing his lithe form. On silver coins from Cyrene and Thessaly, his profile appeared beside a lizard, another of his sacred animals, underscoring his ties to transition and renewal. Debate persists over whether these symbols signified localized cult practices or broader pan-Hellenic association with his wandering spirit. Households honored Hermes Hermaion by placing small herms at doorways and hearth corners, believing his watch would guard both entrance and domestic hearth. The scent of burning bay leaves accompanied morning offerings of fresh breadcrumbs, the crackle of twigs in small fire pits blending with the aroma of baking loaves. Historians still debate whether these domestic rites reflected genuine household religion or later romanticized reconstructions of everyday piety. Through commerce's bustle, travelers' roads, and soul's silent passage, Hermes threaded Greek life with swift connection and cunning insight. As dawn's first light yields to midday bustle on ancient highways, his legacy endures. Every journey begun, every message sent, bears the imprint of his winged grace. From these bustling crossroads, our next step leads inward to the hearth's quiet glow, where the goddess of home and domestic stability gently tends the flame. As the last footsteps fade on winding roads and temple offerings settle, our journey shifts inward to the hearth's glowing heart, where the quiet goddess of home holds dominion. Hestia, eldest sibling of the Olympian clan, presided over hearth and domestic sanctuary, her presence woven into every flicker of home fires and communal feasts. In city-states across Greece, her eternal flame burned in public prytania halls, symbolizing civic unity and domestic harmony. One mainstream historical fact is that in classical Athens, the Prytanean hearth remained alight from foundation until city's fall, tended by priestesses who ensured Hestia's flame never extinguished. Historians still argue whether this perpetual fire served primarily religious functions or reflected pragmatic needs for constant warmth and shared cooking facilities in communal spaces. Within private homes, the hearth fire was rekindled each dawn with embers carried from the public flame, the crackle of coals and scent of smouldering olive wood marking the household's renewal. Matrons sprinkled grains of barley into the embers as morning offerings, producing a hissing sigh that symbolized Hestia's blessing over sustenance and family well-being. A fringe tidbit suggests that some rural villagers preserved tiny clay lamps filled with leftover olive oil under their bedsides, believing the faint, steady glow ensured peaceful dreams. Though physical evidence of such bedside lamps remains scant, and archaeologists debate their prevalence. Ritual meals honored Hestia's gentle stewardship. During family gatherings, hosts offered the first portion of each dish, bread dipped in oil, fennel seed porridge, or roasted chickpeas, to the hearth before distribution. The soft rustle of garments and the clink of wooden ladles against earthenware bowls blended with the warm aroma of spiced herbs, crafting an atmosphere of comfort and reverence. Historians still argue whether these domestic offerings functioned as conscious religious acts or evolved organically from shared cooking customs later interpreted as sacred. In temple precincts, Hestia's statues appeared simple and unadorned, veiled, seated figures holding a pliant flame-shaped staff. Artisans painted them in muted ochre and ivory, the flat colours evoking the hearth's austere elegance. Visitors described the cool smoothness of sculpted stone against their palms and the faint chalky scent of limestone columns. Such sensory details underscored her unassuming power. No thunderbolts or dramatic rituals, but the steady glow that sustained life. Scholarly debate surrounds Hestia's near absence from dramatic myth. Unlike her tempestuous siblings, she rarely intervened in divine intrigues, prompting scholars to question whether she originated as an earlier hearth deity later supplanted by more dynamic Olympians, or whether her unobtrusive role reflects a cultural ideal of domestic stability too sacred for poetic elaboration. A fringe hypothesis posits that pre-Hellenic mother-goddess figures merged into Hestia's identity, embodying primal Earth Mother archetypes now obscured by patriarchal narratives. Community festivals such as the Amphidromia in Attica celebrated Hestia's care over household establishment. During these rites, newborns were carried 3 times around the hearth before being introduced to the family, symbolically integrating them into the protective circle of home. The swish of infant raps and soft cooing mingled with the fire's gentle roar, while mothers whispered blessings that echoed ancient liturgies. Historians still debate whether this circumnavigation rite derived from older fertility rituals or later codified customs to affirm lineage and inheritance. In civic life, magistrates swore oaths by Hestia's flame before enacting decrees, believing the goddess's witness ensured fidelity to civic duties. The crackling fire and its pillar of smoke served as silent adjudicator, rising towards sky and gods alike. Fringe records mention that some officials carried embers in iron lanterns to remote assemblies, rekindling new hearth fires under Hestia's name, though the logistical complexity casts doubt on how widespread this practice truly was. Artisanal life also bore her imprint. Potters dedicated their first keyline-fired vessel to Hestia, chanting brief hymns as they loaded fragile wares into roaring chambers. The hiss of expanding clay and the sweet carbon scent of fired glaze filled workshop courtyards, the heat forging both pots and devotion. Historians still argue whether these dedicatory acts strengthened communal artistic identity or served to ward off kiln mishaps under divine favour. Through unbroken flame and humble offering, Hestia's gentle sovereignty shaped daily rhythms of ancient Greeks. Her hearth-centered worship wove religion seamlessly into the fabric of family life, providing spiritual anchor amid shifting fortunes. As the final embers settle into glowing ash, our path descends into the shadowed domain of the underworld's silent ruler, where the weight of death and debt shapes soul's final rest. As the warmth of home fires fades into twilight's hush, we descend into shadowed depths, where a silent ruler governs the final threshold of mortal life. Hades, sovereign of the underworld and judge of departed souls, reigned in a vast domain beneath the earth's crust, his shadowed halls echoing with the footsteps of the newly dead. In sanctuaries at Eleusis and at small grottos near Pylos, worshippers left libations of honey and water at crossroads, known as the Meadows of Asphodel, to honour his impartial stewardship of life's end. One mainstream historical fact is that the poet Homer describes Hades' realm as a sombre, mist-choked landscape, where shades wander aimlessly, reflecting early Greek conceptions of an afterlife void of rewards or punishments. Historians still argue whether Homeric underworld imagery represents widespread folk beliefs or poetic invention tailored to epic narrative needs. Pilgrims navigating darkened caverns offered libations at low stone altars, the cool air heavy with the damp scent of earth and the faint metallic tang of bronze tripods. They poured mixed wine and barley water over carved stones, tokens of remembrance, while the soft drip of water from stalactites provided a steady, mournful rhythm. A fringe tidbit suggests that some worshippers carried small inscribed tablets naming the deceased, hoping Hades would recall each individual by name, though epigraphic evidence for these magic tablets remains contested among archaeologists. In myth, Hades ruled alongside his queen Persephone, whose seasonal descent and return shaped agricultural cycles. Ancient mysteries at Eleusis dramatized this union. Initiates learned secret rites that mirrored the dark journey and joyous reunion, promising favorable fate after death. Historians still argue whether these Eleusinian ceremonies derived from pre-Greek tonic practices or later theological reinterpretations celebrating hope beyond mortality. Sensory details from underworld rituals emerge in scattered sources. One account describes the muffled echo of chanting voices in subterranean halls lined with black-veined marble, mingling with the musty aroma of damp stone and burning cedar boughs. Torchlight flickered against reliefs depicting three judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, each wielding bronze staffs to weigh mortal deeds. A curious fringe note claims participants carried small pouches of dried mint to mask the odour of decaying offerings, though scholars debate whether mint was used ritually or simply as practical scent mitigation. Hades' iconography emphasized solemn authority. On funerary stelae, he appears seated on a black throne, holding a scepter, and accompanied by his three-headed dog Cerberus, whose growl guarded the boundary between life and death. Face painters used deep indigo and muted ochre to denote the gloom of his realm, while fine brown outlines captured Cerberus's vigilant stance. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on his dark domain aimed to instill fear of death or accepted the inevitability of mortality with stoic resignation. Ritual feasts in Hades' honour occurred on the Kalamaya festival in Olympia, where citizens pinched earth from riverbanks, symbols of interment, and placed it in small clay vessels. The soft scrape of soil into pottery and the whisper of voices reciting invocations created a tactile and auditory tapestry of farewell. Fringe evidence suggests that some participants included fragments of personal items, lockets, or small tools in their vessels, hoping the deceased might retain some earthly comfort, though surviving artifacts rarely preserve such fragile inclusions. Initiates of the Orphic tradition offered more elaborate fare: honey, cakes shaped like winged figures, and wine mixed with honey and water, intended to ease the soul's passage. Orphic texts describe these offerings as necessary to avoid wandering eternally suggesting a more personalized afterlife than Homer's. Historians still argue whether Orphism represented a widespread religious movement or remained a marginal, esoteric sect. Hades' impartial rule extended to all shades, regardless of status. In Homer, even heroes like Achilles lamented their fate, eternal rest without distinction. Yet other sources hint at special fields for the virtuous or the shameless, Elysium and Tartarus, implying a nascent moral economy in the afterlife. Debate persists over whether these regions reflect evolving beliefs about divine justice or later philosophical insertions into traditional myth. Iconic rituals included burying coins, obols, for Charon, the ferryman who conveyed souls across the river Styx. Archaeologists find such coins in graves, their metallic clink on the ribs suggesting a final payment. Some graves include multiple coins or unusual denarii from distant lands, raising questions scholars still debate. Were these extras meant as bribes for smoother passage, or simply family offerings for remembrance? In literature, Hades' voice appears through intermediaries, Hermes' psychopompous guiding souls, and Persephone's whispered counsel of rebirth. Poets describe the hush of tomb chamber readings, the soft rustle of linen grave clothes, and the faint pulse of torchlight on carved stone. Dramatic tragedies sometimes open with hymns to Hades, reminding audiences that all mortal endeavors end in his silent court. Through subterranean rites and funeral offerings, Hades shaped Greek attitudes toward death, not as an end, but as a transformation under impartial rule. His realm, though rife with shadow, provided order where mortal life's chaos gave way to eternal rest. As the whisper of oak leaves in living forests grows distant, our final steps ascend toward revelry and renewal under the god of ecstatic wine, where the gloom of death is met with the promise of joyous celebration. As the shadows of Hades recede, and the hush of underworld halls gives way to the pulse of festal drums, our journey ascends to fields alive with vine and revelry, under a god whose laughter breaks all boundaries. Dionysus, divine patron of wine, festivity, and ecstatic transformation, embodied the liberating spirit that surged through vineyards and wild forests alike. According to myth, he was born twice, first from mortal Semele's womb, and then from Zeus's thigh, symbolizing life's paradox of death and rebirth. One mainstream historical fact is that the city Dionysia festival in Athens featured dramatic competitions honoring him, where playwrights presented tragedies and comedies over several days. Historians still argue whether these theatrical contests originated as ritual enactments of mythic drama or evolved as civic spectacles to unify the populace under shared cultural narratives. Vintners and worshippers gathered in sun-drenched vineyards, the air thick with the sweet perfume of fermenting grapes and crushed leaves. Amphorae of deep crimson wine stood arranged on stone benches, their clay surfaces mottled by dew and grape must, while the distant hum of cicadas provided a cicada-like chorus. Priests in leopard skin cloaks wielded thyrsi, staffs crowned with ivy and pine cones, tapping them on the ground in rhythmic time. A fringe tidbit suggests that some devotees strewed crushed mandrake root in ceremonial retsina to induce mild euphoria before the grand procession. Though chemical analyses of ancient residues remain inconclusive, and scholars debate the practice's authenticity, Dionysus's rites, often called bacchanalia, unfolded under moonlight in wooded clearings, where participants danced in swirling circles, their robes dyed in russet and saffron. Goatskin drums and bronze cymbals clanged as arms whipped ivy wreaths through the air, stirring heady tumult. Worshippers claimed to feel the earth's heartbeat underfoot, each pulse echoing the god's ecstatic power. Historians still argue whether these nocturnal celebrations reflected genuine mystical experience, or served as social release valves for frustrations in rigid civic life. In mythic tales, Dionysus tamed wild beasts and led Maenades, female followers, into frenzied dances. Vase painters depicted these scenes with jagged outlines, faces contorted in rapture, and Bacchic thyrsus raised high. The flat colour fields of teal and ochre emphasised movement over detail. Fringe accounts from Roman-era observers recount that some Maenades danced so wildly they appeared to tear at the bark of trees, believing the spirits within, awakened by their fervour, though archaeologists dispute whether such arboreal rituals occurred or emerged in literary imagination. The wine's transformative power lay at the heart of his cult. At symposiums, participants reclined on cushioned couches around low tables strewn with olives, figs, and salted fish, sipping mixed wine in melodic toasts. The clink of kylix cups and warm breath of laughter mingled with the fragrance of crushed rose petals strewn on the floor. Elders whispered about treading grapes with bare feet, a symbolic reenactment of Dionysus's own vineyard labours, though pottery imagery suggests that practical treading tools often replaced human feet. Oracles of Dionysus, though less famed than Delphi's, appeared in shrines such as those at Pergamon, where priests interpreted swirling wine patterns in bowls to divine futures. The gentle slosh of liquid and the gleam of grapeseed motes in lamplight formed an aleatoric script. Historians still debate whether wine reading formed a systematic practice or functioned as captivating performance for initiates seeking revelations. Artisans crafted Dionysian symbols across mosaics and frescoes, grapevine borders, satyr masks with sly grins, and entwined vines emerging from ornamental amphora handles. On Greek kylix, satyrs poured wine for reclining patrons, their animalistic limbs capturing mirthful abandon. Technicians applied shell gold accents to represent wine's precious value, though modern restorations wrestle with distinguishing original gilding from later embellishments. Legal and social norms intersected with his cult. In Bacchic controversies of the 2nd century, Roman authorities suppressed excessive rites, accusing worshippers of moral subversion. Trial records reveal that women caught in secret gatherings faced exile or harsher punishment. Historians still argue whether these crackdowns targeted genuine abominations or served elite anxieties over uncontrolled female autonomy and popular assemblies. Mythic narratives explore Dionysus's compassion and cruelty. He offered King Midas the gift of gold touch, only to reverse the boon when gold turned to curse, teaching lessons on desire and moderation. Playwrights, from Euripides to the tragedian Ennius, dramatized his dual nature, bringing ecstasy and unbridled madness in equal measure. Scholars debate whether these stories underscored human vulnerability to excess or mirrored psychological experiences of ritual dissolution of self. Through wine's red thrill and dance's wild abandon, Dionysus opened portals to altered consciousness and communal unity. His presence in daily life ranged from vineyard labours to after-dark revels, a reminder that release and restraint danced together in ancient worldviews. Now, as the echoes of drums and laughter drift into distant memory, allow yourself to settle into calm reflection. Picture a single goblet of crimson wine left on a low table, its surface still rippling with earlier toasts. Inhale deeply, noting how the faint sweetness of grape and rose lingers. Then exhale, releasing any remnants of fervour or restlessness. Imagine the gentle warmth of Dionysian radiance ebbing like twilight's glow, leaving behind a soft hush that drapes over vineyards and villages alike. The rustle of vine leaves in a moonlit breeze grows distant, and in its place, a quiet hum emerges, the steady rhythm of your own breath. Each inhale brings peaceful awareness. Each exhale carries away tension. Consider the tapestry of Greek gods we've traversed. Zeus's thunder, Hera's vigilance, Poseidon's waves, Demeter's harvest, Athena's wisdom, Apollo's light, Artemis's moonlit chase, Ares's clash, Aphrodite's allure, Hephaestus's forge, Hermes's flight, Hestia's hearth, Hades' hush, and finally Dionysus's revel. Each deity embodies human aspiration and fear, weaving divine threads into mortal lives. Now those threads unravel into silent repose. As you sink deeper into comfort, feel the legacy of these ancient figures settle like soft dust on your mind, each tale a gentle echo that guides you towards stillness. The world of myth recedes, its gods returning to Olympus, underworld, and vine-clad groves, leaving you cradled in tranquil darkness. Let your shoulders soften, your eyelids grow heavy, and your heartbeat slow to a gentle cadence. In this serene space beyond myth and revelry, allow sleep's embrace to carry you onward. Sweet dreams.